Intervals, Part 1. Half of everything you need to know so you don't fail music class in 7 minutes. Intervals are a measurement of the distance between two notes. They're an important part of the vocabulary of music and are useful in discussing the qualities, structure, and functions of scales, chords, and melodies. They are also useful for increasing your prowess at sight reading, sight singing, composition, and improvisation. As with most things in music theory, familiarity with major scales and key signatures is fundamental to understanding intervals. If you're not confident on those concepts, you're going to have a bad time. Check the links in the description if you need to brush up on those concepts. Intervals are defined by a quality and a number. They have names like major third, minor third, diminished third, or augmented third, or perfect fifth, diminished fifth, or augmented fifth. The quality of an interval is determined by comparing the top note to the major scale of the bottom note. The number is much simpler, so we'll start there. The number in an interval is a measure of the relative position of two notes on the staff. It's defined by how many letter names are between the two notes, including the notes themselves. For instance, this is a fifth, because from A to E there are 5 letter names. You might imagine there are notes on every line and space and count each one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A to E is a fifth. It's important to note that the number of the interval is independent of any accidentals that might be on the notes. So, this is still a fifth, as is this, and even this. They're all 5 letter names away on the staff, so they're all fifths. Let's look at a few more. This is a second, a third, and a fourth. Here's a sixth and a seventh. And here's a ninth and an 11th. Intervals of 1 or 8 have special names because they involve 2 notes of the same name, like C to C or C to C. They're still notated with the number, but are commonly referred to as unison and octave. A 15th is 2 octaves, like C to C, but for some reason it doesn't have a special name. Personally, I like to call it Duboctia, the Destroyer. To review, this is a unison, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, 7th, and octave, as well as 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, and Duboctia, the Destroyer. As we said before, intervals also have a quality such as major, minor, perfect, augmented, or diminished. There are a number of different symbols and abbreviations that are used for these qualities, but I'll be using these because I think they're the least ambiguous. In any major scale, the interval from the first note of that scale to the first, 4th, 5th, or 8th notes of the scale are referred to as perfect. Perfect unison, perfect 4th, perfect 5th, and perfect octave. The distance from the first note of the scale to the 2nd, 3rd, 6th, and 7th note are all referred to as major. Major 2nd, major 3rd, major 6th, and major 7th. Of course, these interval qualities are the same for any major scale. For instance, in D major, from the first note of the scale, the interval of unison, 4th, 5th, or octave are all called perfect, and the 2nd, 3rd, 6th, and 7th are all called major. You may be wondering, why are some intervals called perfect and some intervals are called major? Look, I know it seems arbitrary. There's a reason, I promise. It just won't make any sense until we cover a little bit more. For now, just go with it. So far, we've only been looking at intervals from the first note of a major scale to any other note in that scale. But what happens if the upper note doesn't appear in the major scale of the bottom note? That's when you get into those other qualities, minor, diminished, and augmented. The quality of an interval is determined by comparing it to the major or perfect interval that normally occurs in a major scale. For instance, these are all thirds. C to E is a major third because E is natural in C major. All the other thirds have been altered from the major third in some way. C to E flat is 1 semitone smaller. It's referred to as a minor third. Any major interval that's been made smaller by a semitone is referred to as minor. Any interval that's been made 2 semitones smaller, like C to E double flat, is known as diminished. Finally, any major interval that's been made a semitone larger is augmented, like C to E sharp. This applies to all the major intervals. These are all sixths. The first one is major because A is natural in the key of C. The next is a minor sixth because the interval is 1 semitone smaller than the major. Next is diminished because it's 2 semitones smaller than the major. And the last one is augmented because it's 1 semitone larger than the major. These are all seconds and sevenths. As you can see, the major intervals are just as they appear in the major scale. The minor intervals are 1 semitone smaller. The diminished intervals are 2 semitones smaller. And the augmented intervals are 1 semitone larger. Let's try another key. D to F sharp is a major third because F is sharp in D major. D to F natural is 1 semitone smaller than the major third, so it's a minor third. D to F flat is 2 semitones smaller than the major third, so it's diminished. D to F double sharp is 1 semitone larger than the major third, so it's an augmented third. And here are the different possible seconds, sixths, and sevenths in D major. Pause the video if you'd like to inspect and compare the intervals. So far, we've only been talking about alterations for major intervals. The perfect intervals are similar with one important difference. While the major intervals have 4 forms, major, minor, augmented, and diminished, the perfect intervals only have 3. Augmented is the same, 1 semitone larger, but 1 semitone smaller is called diminished. There is no minor version of the perfect intervals. I know you're still wondering why some intervals are perfect and others are major. I haven't forgotten, we're getting there. So, this first interval is a perfect fifth, because G is natural in C major. But if it's made a semitone larger, it's an augmented fifth. And if it's a semitone smaller, it's a diminished fifth. Same thing for fourth. This is a perfect fourth. 1 semitone larger is augmented, and 1 semitone smaller is diminished. Also, the perfect octave can be made augmented or diminished by making it a semitone larger or smaller. A perfect unison can be augmented, but a diminished unison isn't really a thing. Remember, an interval is always evaluated by the key of the lower note. If you had a perfect unison and made the upper note lower, then you've actually made it lower than the first note, and now nothing makes sense. It's kind of like dividing a number by 0. It makes things complicated. So, to review, a major interval is any second, third, sixth, or seventh where the upper note appears in the major scale of the lower note. A major interval that's been made a semitone smaller is known as minor, 2 semitones smaller is diminished, and a semitone larger is augmented. A perfect interval is any unison, fourth, fifth, or octave where the upper note appears in the major scale of the lower note. A perfect interval that's been made a semitone smaller is known as diminished. If it's been made a semitone larger, it's augmented. And that's half of what you need to know about intervals. In part 2, we'll cover intervals larger than an octave, what to do if the bottom note isn't in a major scale, and inversions, which will finally explain why some intervals are perfect and some are major. Be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more videos. Thanks for watching.